Out of all of the reported contradictory statements by Sir Keir Starmer, this is the latest and one of the most obvious hypocrisies to hit the news. Yes, it involves Sir Keir Starmer receiving a donation of over £20,000. Yes, I think it's contradictory with some of the policies that they are currently running, and yes, it's politics. So before we go any further, I'd just like to say thank you to all of those that have subscribed in the last day or two, because as I mentioned before, about 60% of you that watch my channel regularly don't subscribe, and I'd be really grateful if you do. So I'm really grateful to all of those that have subscribed in the last couple of days, and so we can get that unsubscribed number down. So if you want a brutally honest appraisal of what I see going on in the media, I'll give you both sides usually, and I'll make it clear if it's my opinion. Please do subscribe, and I'll be your brutally honest alternative to the mainstream media. And please do make sure you watch till the end, because there's a surprising and rather bizarre twist in the winter fuel allowance. More about that at the very end of the video. So let's have a look at what I'm talking about here. So Sir Keir Starmer, now reportedly, in the latest and greatest, accepted a donation of £20,437 from, you guessed it, Labour peer Lord Ali. What was it for? Well, there's a reason that I say this is hypocrisy, and probably justifies the term two-tier Keir, in my personal view, for legal reasons, which I'll explain in a moment. He says to the BBC, "At the beginning of the election, which we didn't know when it was going to be called, my boy was in the middle of his GCSEs. Every sympathy for anyone going through exams. He says, I made him a promise that he'll be able to get to his school and do his exams without being disturbed. He says, we had a lot of journalists outside the house where we lived, part of the nature, if you like, of being a politician, having journalists around, and the effect that it has on members of your family. He says, I'm not complaining about that, that's fine, but if you're a 16-year-old trying to do your GCSEs, your one chance in life, I'll come back to that in a moment, I promised him we'd move somewhere, we'd get out of the house and go somewhere where we could be peacefully studying. Someone then offered me accommodation where we could do that. I took it up, and it was the right thing to do for my boy. It didn't cost the taxpayer a penny. Asked if it was Lord Ali, he said yes, of course. But my primary concern, he says, was it wasn't about influencing government. It was about making sure my boy could do his GCSEs without wading through loads of journalists outside my house. Now, I make no criticism of that, save that it is a hypocrisy, for reasons I'll explain. Now, at the same time as it's reported that Sir Keir Starmer accepted a £20,000 donation so that his son's studies would not be interrupted, it's also reported that the impact assessment for the removal of VAT exemption on schools is being done just weeks before the policy is due to come into effect. Now, I did say from time to time I'll talk about political issues on this channel where they become newsworthy, even though some people say I shouldn't. Clearly, the views and the interest says otherwise, so I will do so. But I'm sure we can all agree that we might have different views and we won't get annoyed with each other with our different views, and we can just discuss them here. There's always two sides of looking at it. So as I said, at the same time it's reported he accepted this donation, they are rushing through this impact assessment for the removal of the VAT exemption on private schools. Now, the impact on this is very real. Now, both personally and professionally, I've been approached by a number of people who've had their children removed from school for one reason or another, either for SEN reasons, special educational needs, or because they've broken the school rules and they've been expelled. This is from private schools. Or, as in some cases, the parents simply fear that they won't be able to afford the fees to include the VAT, so they've withdrawn the child to put them elsewhere. The very real impact of this is that local schools have struggled to place but a single child. And I know of parents that have approached 2 or 3 schools in the local area who've not been able to place a single child, and they've had to move out of the area. And this is not an uncommon thing. A few people have told me exactly the same thing. Now, again, regardless of your views about VAT on private school fees, some of you might think that it's absolutely right that these fees should be applied, and some of you think, well, education is purely for the children, it's a good thing for the children, and therefore should retain the exemption from VAT. But nonetheless, this impact statement is being done very shortly before this removal of the VAT exemption is due to come into effect, which does have the real potential of forcing some of these schools into closure, or at the very least, some parents withdrawing their children because they won't be able to afford the fees. Why does all that matter, regardless of your personal political opinion? Well, it's because of the hypocrisy. Because some of those children will have their education disturbed and they'll have to move to another school and their whole schooling and education is going to be disrupted. But in this case, apparently it's okay for Sir Keir Starmer to receive a £20,000 donation so that his son's education's not disrupted. Now, I agree that it shouldn't be disrupted. I have no criticism of the donation or the alternative accommodation, or the fact that he didn't want his son's education disrupted. But given that that is just one case, and it was possibly going to be disrupted by journalists being outside of the house, imagine now if a school does close and there are hundreds, if not thousands of children that have all of their education disrupted at all levels throughout the school, and they have to not only move schools, maybe move out of the area. The various other schools are going to have new children coming in, which is inherently a disruption on those. And one of the most ridiculous things that I read online just recently was that a state school could not find a place for a child that had left a private school. And so, having a duty to place that child into education, they paid for the private school place to send the child back to the private school from whence they came. Now, I can't quite get my head around how ridiculous that is. So the impending VAT exemption removal forced the parent to take the child out, seek a place at the local state school, and the state school could not provide a place, therefore paid for the place at the private school. Work that out. And that's far from the only news story about all of this. The news is full of these kind of stories. In one case, a local authority had to apologise to parents because they asked them to prove that they can't afford to send their child to the private school if they wanted a place in the state school. Now, like I said, regardless of your personal views about this, whether you are for or against the VAT on school fees, that's perfectly fine and I respect your view. But like I said, this is a hypocrisy. In my personal view, if the current Prime Minister accepted a £20,000 donation to ensure that his son's education was not disrupted, whilst risking that that is exactly what's going to happen to lots of others. I'm sure you've got your personal views about it. As I said, I won't criticise you for your views, whether you agree or disagree, but this is of course newsworthy and yet another contradiction about all of these donations. And just before you go, that's not all, because Sky News also reports that a Labour conference votes to reverse the cut to the winter fuel allowance in an embarrassing blow to Starmer. Of course, you're all aware about that, and you're all aware of the expenses that various politicians have claimed, but this Labour conference has voted to reverse the winter fuel allowance cut. And whilst there's nothing binding about this vote, it obviously does put pressure, further pressure on Sir Keir Starmer and his Labour government about these cuts to the winter fuel allowance. So again, and about any of that, let me know your thoughts and comments in the box below. Please do make sure you subscribe for a brutally honest appraisal of how I see things here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.